Do you know that the Middle Passage was one of the most painful and heartbreaking events in human history? Millions of Africans were kidnapped, forced into slavery, and taken on a terrifying journey across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. This part of the transatlantic slave trade is called the Middle Passage, and it was a time of unbearable suffering, loss, and brutality. Through Black Stories Untold, we reveal the true, untold stories of those who lived through this horror, those who were torn from their homes, their families, and their freedom. We honor their courage and strength in the face of unimaginable adversity. The Middle Passage was more than just a route across the ocean. It symbolized the complete dehumanization of millions of Africans, where people were treated as mere property and commodities to be bought and sold. These individuals, who had once lived normal lives within their families and communities, were suddenly subjected to the violent process of capture and enslavement. Traders, both African and European, raided entire villages, enslaving survivors and marching them to coastal fortresses that became symbols of despair and terror. Before even reaching the shores of the Americas, the captives faced brutal conditions. The journey began deep in the interior of Africa, where powerful kingdoms such as the Ashanti and the Dahomey collaborated with European traders to capture prisoners of war or weaker tribes. These kingdoms profited by selling captives to the Europeans, and the captured individuals were often the spoils of war or victims of violent raids. Once captured, the enslaved Africans were shackled in chains, marched long distances, sometimes across hundreds of miles towards the coast. This march, often referred to as the journey to the coast, was in itself a deadly ordeal. Chained by the neck or feet, they were forced to walk for days, weeks, or even months. Starvation, disease, and the sheer physical exhaustion from the brutal march claimed the lives of many. Those who were too weak or too ill to continue were often left behind to die. The survivors reached the slave forts or castles along the West African coast, places like Elmina Castle and Cape Coast Castle in present-day Ghana. These forts became holding pens where the enslaved Africans awaited transportation to the Americas. Their time spent here, locked in dark, filthy dungeons, separated from their families, was a period of unbearable uncertainty. Once the ships arrived, a new chapter of horror began. The captives were herded aboard ships, which were designed to carry goods, not human beings. However, these vessels were packed with people, often beyond their capacity, to maximize profit for the traders. In the lower decks of these ships, men, women, and children were separated and crammed into tight, suffocating spaces with barely enough room to move. The heat and humidity were stifling, and the stench of human waste, sweat, and blood filled the air. Conditions were so unsanitary that diseases like smallpox, dysentery, and measles spread like wildfire, further decimating the captive population. Shackled together with iron chains, many of the captives were forced to sit or crouch in these unspeakable conditions for weeks or even months as the ships made their perilous journey across the Atlantic. Known as the Middle Passage, this voyage typically lasted anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks, depending on the winds and weather. The captives were given little food or water, just enough to keep them alive, and those who were too weak or ill to continue were often thrown overboard. The ocean became a graveyard for the dead, and sharks were said to have followed the slave ships, drawn by the bodies of the enslaved people tossed into the sea. Do you know that the Middle Passage was so deadly that historians estimate up to 2 million Africans died during the journey? Out of the 12 million Africans who were taken from their homes, only around 10 million survived to reach the Americas. The rest perished along the way, victims of disease, starvation, dehydration, and violence. Some died of heartbreak, unable to bear the separation from their families and their homeland. The sheer loss of life makes the Middle Passage one of the darkest chapters in human history. Despite the unimaginable horrors they faced, many enslaved Africans resisted their captors at every stage of the journey. Some fought back during the initial raids on their villages, while others attempted to escape during the long march to the coast. Even aboard the slave ships, acts of resistance occurred. Some refused to eat, attempting to starve themselves rather than face the horrors that awaited them. Others organized rebellions, seizing any opportunity to overthrow their captors and gain control of the ship. One of the most famous of these rebellions was the Amistad Revolt in 1839, where a group of enslaved Africans, led by a man named Cinque, overpowered the crew of the ship and tried to sail back to Africa. Though they were eventually recaptured, their story became a symbol of resistance and courage. The revolt inspired future generations and demonstrated the unbreakable human spirit, even in the face of oppression and dehumanization. Some enslaved Africans made the ultimate sacrifice, choosing to jump overboard and drown rather than live in chains. These individuals were often seen as heroes by their fellow captives, their defiant choice serving as a powerful reminder of the strength and dignity that could not be taken away, even in the most desperate circumstances. Upon reaching the shores of the Americas, the survivors of the Middle Passage were greeted by the brutality of the auction block. Families were ripped apart as husbands, wives, and children were sold to different owners. Stripped of their names, their identities, and their languages, they were reduced to nothing more than property, forced to toil in the plantations, mines, or homes of their new masters. Life on the plantations was characterized by constant brutality and backbreaking labor. The enslaved Africans were forced to work from sunrise to sunset, often with little food or rest. The punishment for defiance or failure to meet expectations was swift and severe. Whippings, beatings, and mutilation were common. Women were subjected to sexual abuse and exploitation, while men endured the harshest physical labor. In such conditions, survival itself was an act of resistance. Despite the overwhelming oppression, enslaved Africans found ways to resist and maintain their sense of self. They formed close-knit communities, held on to their cultural traditions, and passed down stories, songs, and spiritual practices from their homeland. These traditions survived and thrived, eventually becoming the cultural foundations for African American and Afro-Caribbean communities today. The Middle Passage has left a lasting scar on the history of Africa and the Americas. The transatlantic slave trade not only tore apart African communities, but also caused lasting trauma that affected generations of African descendants. In the Americas, the descendants of enslaved Africans have had to fight for centuries for their freedom, equality, and human rights. The legacy of slavery is still felt today, manifesting in forms of systemic racism, discrimination, and inequality. But the story of the Middle Passage is not only one of pain and suffering, it is also a story of survival, resilience, and triumph. The Africans who endured this journey, who fought back against their oppressors, and who found ways to preserve their culture and dignity, have left behind a powerful legacy. Their strength and courage continue to inspire people around the world, reminding us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit remains unbroken. As we tell the stories of the Middle Passage and other untold tales of African history, we invite you to join us in honoring the memories of those who came before us. Through Black Stories Untold, we reveal the truth of these painful histories, bringing light to the darkness and giving a voice to those who were silenced. We encourage you to subscribe to Black Stories Untold, leave a comment about where you are watching from, and share this story with others. Together, we can ensure that the history of the Middle Passage and the strength of those who survived it is never forgotten.